Hello, welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Damien.
And I'm Aaron. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week, we'll bring something new to the table, discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Aaron is up this week. What are you bringing to the table today, my friend?
I am bringing an article from Scalawag magazine called Louisiana is the Blueprint for Further Fascist Repression, which was written by Gabrielle A. She is an epidemiologist living in New Orleans and is the founder of the Thurman Perry Foundation, a nonprofit operating nationally with a mission of aiding women and girls impacted by incarceration.
Wow.
And so the point of this article is established pretty early on for me. She says, quote, "My fellow community members and I must now contend with a new level of repression at a time when our state, along with the rest of the South, continues to struggle against an increasingly fascist political climate that warrants nothing less than endless uprisings." And then she goes on to talk about several aspects of how Louisiana's far-right politicians are influencing the country through legislative actions in the branch there, key figures in Louisiana who are now holding positions of power across the country. And there's a lot of particular bills and laws and policies and people here that point to a definable authoritarian agenda by these folks and how they want to spread that across the country to the rest of us.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot here to talk about, and there's a lot to potentially focus on. Right? Like, she talks about a lot of things, and there's a lot of rabbit holes to follow in the article. So, I'm looking forward to what we decide to talk about here today, because there's so many different directions we could go in. But what about you? What do you think?
That made me think of, you said a lot of rabbit holes. It made me think just there's a lot of application of this, right?
Yes,
And there's lots of ways in which lots of places we can go, but a lot of scary things happening that, can have an impact on, I think, all of us. And I thought that's what made this a really powerful piece, to say the least. And like with every paragraph I read, I just got more and more concerned, not only about the state of Louisiana and the folks who live there, but I think the larger intent of this piece is to warn all of us about the potential impact of what's happening in Louisiana on all of us, on our election, on our national politics, really on all of us in every way. And as you say, Gabrielle warns us about the legislative decisions coming out of Louisiana, the laws coming out of Louisiana, these politicians, like really prominent politicians who have risen into very powerful positions in our federal government, and these pockets of fascism that are now not really even pockets of fascism within our federal government. And again, all of that in sum, I think, has the potential to have a tremendously negative impact on all of our First Amendment rights to freedom of assembly. Gabrielle really talks about that in this piece, but also on our broader civil and human rights. So right then and there, like the sirens were blaring in my mind as I read through this. And to me, this whole piece and what I read about what's happening in Louisiana just reminded me of this like age-old scenario where if it can happen to folks in one place of the country. And in this case, in one of the examples that Gabrielle shared, she was talking about the Supreme Court upholding a Louisiana state court's decision that ultimately suppresses dissent in the state. So if it can happen there, what's to stop it from happening to us here in Maryland, for example, or really anywhere in the United States? And so that to me and all of this is a really big concern to me, and it should be to all of us.
Yes, and I think that it highlights why the rights agenda for so long has been focused on the courts.
Yes.
And why Mitch McConnell blocked so many of Barack Obama's court nominations on the lower bench, not just the Supreme Court and what he did toward the end of President Obama's term, but throughout, just blocking people throughout. And so there was a huge set of vacancies across the federal bench, which then Trump filled.
Yes.
However he wanted, with a lot of people who weren't qualified but believed all the same things that he did.
Absolutely. And we're seeing the impact of that here
Yes.
and in other places. Absolutely.
So, in addition to that, the legislature in Louisiana has been busy
Yeah.
introducing all kinds of heinous bills, including laws that would classify abortion as murder, which would have made the person receiving the abortion and the person performing it eligible for the death penalty in Louisiana.
Yeah.
Defunding domestic violence shelters, creating their own versions of don't say gay laws and bathroom bills, and expanding what's acceptable for how they can put people to death. So they want to include electrocution again and nitrogen hypoxia.
So wild. Yeah.
So there's a lot to dive into here, but I want to talk about a case where a woman had to travel to New York to obtain an abortion because the fetus that she was carrying had been diagnosed with fetal acrania, which means that there was no development of a skull.
Right.
So instead of being able to access healthcare for a necessary medical procedure locally, this person had to travel and far.
Right.
And then when asked about this, Jeff Landry, who was the attorney general for Louisiana at the time and is now the governor, said that if people don't like the Louisiana law banning abortion or their constitution, they should just move, which is the knee-jerk reaction to all of this that all of these right-wing politicians have. It's like, well, just move. But they want this to be the law everywhere.
Right.
So that's not really a factor.
Yes.
Like we could just move, but you're trying to chase me down to make
Wherever
this
I
illegal
go.
everywhere.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So that's fun.
That's fun. Yeah. I want to talk about this too. I think one of the most concerning things taking place in Louisiana over the past few years is all of these legislative decisions.
Yeah.
Right. And it's not just abortion. I mean, it's around education. It's around LGBTQ plus people's rights, as you mentioned, human rights, and just so much more. And so one of the first examples in this piece that Gabrielle shares is Louisiana's legislative decisions around abortion. So I wanted to actually pull her quote. She says, quote, "Following the Dobbs decision in 2022, the state witnessed this bipartisan coalition of state legislators enact a near total outlawing of abortion. The abortion ban was supported by every female Louisiana senator, led by Democratic Senator Katrina Jackson, who sponsored the anti-abortion legislation, which was signed into law by outgoing Democratic Governor John Bel Edwards, following the Dobbs decisions activating the state's trigger law. Republican Louisiana legislator Danny McCormick put the state in the national spotlight after he introduced legislation that would classify abortion as homicide. This is to your point, making both people who obtain abortions and their health care providers eligible for the death penalty in Louisiana.
Yep.
After a national outcry, the bill was voluntarily pulled. And so, it's the other thing that really stood out to me about this, in addition to all the things you mentioned, were this idea that this was supported by Democrats in Louisiana as well, right? And so to me, that's one thing that's super wild about this. The other concerning thing is like the notion of the death penalty. Like, how is the death penalty on the table for this? Like, how is that the place that our elected officials are going? It kind of boggles my mind that would even be something that could be on the table here. Like, it's so extreme, and you use the word heinous. It's so heinous, and I just really can't fathom that. But I think all of this just points to this idea that Gabrielle offers in this piece that showcases that how Louisiana is anti-progressive and is working to chip away at the civil liberties of all of its residents, which again, as I mentioned earlier, the sort of sirens in my head, this should be a warning sign to all of us.
Yes, it's a warning sign to all of us. Also, the bill that they introduced, that this man introduced to make abortion equal to murder, is terrible. And it gives the game away for them too.
Say more about that.
Because the party line, is that this is about life and it's about supporting life. But if you don't follow through on how we think you should support life, we're going to kill you.
Yeah, we're going to end your life.
So it lays bare that this is not about life at all. It's about control, and it's about how they want us to behave in their way, matching their religious beliefs, rather than in any other kind of way that we might actually believe in too. So I think it's like they put their hoods on, so to speak, and showed us who they were.
Yes.
And that just gives us the agenda that they actually have.
Absolutely.
I think.
And I thought where you were going with that was, and then they kept the hood on.
Yeah, well, they didn't really take it off.
Yeah.
But speaking of Steve Scalise,
Yes.
not really. We can talk about Steve Scalise if you want. I mentioned him at the end of last week's episode.
Yes.
But anyway, this article is written with the context of the Supreme Court's decision back in April. We mentioned this a little bit earlier, but the Supreme Court decision in April to uphold the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals decision to hold DeRay McKesson liable for the injuries of a police officer at a rally that he helped organize.
Right.
And this is a hugely chilling decision for protest and First Amendment rights, because who wants to take on the liability of a crowd of people who could theoretically do anything?
Anything.
And then you get held liable for it because your name is on the permit, or you shared the event in your social media accounts, or somehow you're able to be tied to the event as an organizer, as somebody who brought the people together.
Right.
So there's that. And then you add in that the Louisiana legislature passed a bill that, quote, shields private citizens who are concealed carry gun owners from prosecution in wrongful death civil suits. So it doesn't seem that far-fetched to me. Again, I'm not a lawyer, and I don't play one on this podcast or on TV. But it doesn't seem that far-fetched. You could connect the dots here and somebody could organize a protest and have somebody show up to that protest with a gun, and then something happens and someone gets shot by that person with that gun. And now the person who organized the protest is liable for those injuries in a civil court.
Yep.
And the damage is there, and the person who actually did the shooting is not liable and is not eligible to be liable or to be sued for that wrongful death.
Yep.
And that's just hard to understand in the grand scheme of things, that would be the way that this could happen.
Yep.
But given the way that these things seem to be playing out, it seems like that would be the scenario we could easily find ourselves in.
Absolutely. It reminds me of something one of my cousins says all the time. Make it make sense.
Make it make sense.
Make it make sense.
Yeah.
And you just, drafted the scenario right there.
Yeah.
And so, I'm glad you, and I'm thank you for talking more about the actual case at hand here. It's really scary. And that's, again, speaks to that point of what does then our First Amendment rights look like in this scenario, particularly in Louisiana. But then again, if this becomes a model for other states, then again, I think we're all kind of in trouble here, right? When it comes to dissent. Absolutely. There's so much we could talk about in this piece, and so much of it and what's happening in Louisiana is really frightening. Jeff Landry, who you mentioned as Louisiana's governor, and he's done so many just awful things, right? So from his time as attorney general, and you mentioned this where he publicly said if folks don't like the anti-abortion laws, they should just move out of the state. And I appreciate your point of, but you're trying to track me everywhere, really. Yeah. To his administration taking power and immediately passing 11 bills into law that reversed progressive criminal justice reforms of the previous administration, to, again, his work as attorney general in convening a coalition to limit people's abilities to travel out of state for reproductive and gender-affirming healthcare across the country, right? And so this is the point I wanted to talk about. Gabrielle shares this, quote, since the American people's constitutional right to abortion were overturned, then Attorney General Jeff Landry formed a 17-state coalition of attorney generals with the expressed goal of limiting people's ability to travel out of state to obtain reproductive health care and forbidding access to gender-affirming care for trans youth by fortifying legislature and prosecutorial reach. The goal of the coalition is to become a national model under Republican leadership to ensure abortion and gender-affirming care are banned nationwide. And I went and looked this up. The other states in the coalition, I was like, we got to name these. Alabama, Alaska, Arkansas, Georgia, Idaho, Indiana, Kentucky, Missouri, Montana, Mississippi, Nebraska, North Dakota, Ohio, South Dakota, Tennessee, and Utah.
It's like a worse version of that Animaniacs song.
It really is, right? Yeah. Now that we're adults, we understand what this means. So we see here that support for this kind of troubling legislation and this assault on people's rights in so many states across the country. It's everywhere. And so, again, I just go back to those warning bells in my head. Like, this coalition of attorneys general in all of these states believe in this and have that hood up and are actively working to deny people their rights and deny people health care. And that leads me to think, where's the limit? Where does that work stop?
Yeah, the limit does not exist.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think you're right.
I think they will just keep it going. And yeah, so speaking of limits and things not existing in terms of limits, I think we're talking about application here. So let's go ahead and officially talk about it. How are we applying this to our everyday lives and work? My application comes from the closing paragraph. Gabrielle Perry says, quote, "With the growing influence of Louisiana on the national political landscape, the question becomes what the rest of America can do to fight against the undue influence of the state's far-right political leaders. The upcoming presidential election is fast approaching, making the need for every American to educate themselves on the ballot's impact on their daily lives and the lives of their fellow citizens dire." And I believe that the ballot will never bring us true liberation.
Yeah.
I don't think that the way that our government is set up would do that.
Yep.
That's not how that works.
Yep.
But there's a lot of damage that can be done to all of us through the ballot if we're not paying attention.
Absolutely.
And they're already doing it.
Yes.
It's already happening.
Yeah.
You know, Project 2025 is a real thing and is a real proposal, and they're already doing some of the pieces of it in small ways, testing grounds like in Louisiana and in Florida and other places, and the 17 states you named in that coalition. Mm-hmm. But the decisions that politicians can make using the levers of government, they're sweeping and potentially very violent and based in control. And so we have to pay close attention and block that heinous stuff that they want to do. And I think that's where a lot of my energy is right now as I think about it, is how do we stop this forward momentum that it seems like that they have?
Right.
Because it's harder to organize for liberation on the other side of this agenda being fully implemented across the right. There's not the landscape for people organizing, coming together to dissent against things like that completely changes because that Supreme Court decision spreads even further. And
Absolutely.
Like all of that stuff snowballs and it becomes more difficult to show up and demand
and organize and fight.
And organize for the world that we deserve.
Absolutely.
So that's where my application is for this week. What about you? What are you thinking?
I couldn't agree with you more. I couldn't agree with Gabrielle more. I appreciate her use of the word dire there, and the call to action for, as she says, every American, all of us, to educate ourselves on the issues on the ballot, not just the politicians on the ballot, but the issues that are at stake here that will definitely have an impact on all of our lives. And, I think we all need to be concerned about that. We all need to be concerned about what's happening in Louisiana and places like it. One of the other things she says, another quote I pulled was, she says, "Though the legislative landscape is proving dire for many Louisiana residents, the rest of the nation is not shielded from the consequences of Louisiana's legislative decisions," right? Yeah. So we have to recognize that things happening in individual states can have an impact on all of us. And we've talked about how that's possible here. And so, I think in this way, we are actively bearing witness to a rapid expansion and implementation of fascist and oppressive legislation and political decisions that are having a far-reaching and dangerous impact on all of us. Yeah. So the imperative to fight it at every level is huge. Mm-hmm. And that's my application from this.
Yeah, that's spot on.
Yeah.
I think the way that those legislative experiments happen too is also a key piece of all of this, because these politicians aren't writing these things themselves. Mm-hmm. They're being handed them by far-right think tanks who believe that this is the way our country should be.
Yes, this is the way.
This is the way that it should be shaped. So, great application.
Thank you.
Very uplifting application. So let's move on to homework. Let's talk about some homework. What do we want to do to continue our learning and unlearning beyond our conversation today? I want to learn more about the Movement Media Alliance. So this is a little bit of a tangent, but They announced this last week, and it's a coalition of progressive media organizations that are, quote, working to build a journalism of accountability based on social justice.
Yes.
So that's how I found this article. Scalawag is one of the participating organizations, along with Truth Out, Prism, In These Times, Inquest, The Forge, Haymarket Books, and a lot more.
Yes.
Too. So I want to learn more about the Alliance and some of the other organizations involved, because the ones that I named are ones that we've all talked about here on the podcast before, pulled articles from and talked about their pieces before, or their books or what have you. But I want to pay attention more to what they're doing, what they're collectively publishing, and how they're moving and making an impact in how we understand what media is for social justice.
Absolutely. Yeah, I can't remember which organization posted about this. They probably all did, but the one I saw, and I posted it to our Interdependent Study Instagram account story, because I'm like, this is awesome, right?
Yeah.
When the work that this alliance is doing. And as you mentioned, there are a ton of folks participating in this, or that are a part of it, I should say. And so, yeah, I want to co-sign that homework. There's a lot we could learn there, and from this alliance. So that's awesome. I would like to do some more reading. This piece was incredible. Like so many of the incredible pieces that we read, there were so many links in this piece to other articles about all of the legislation that's being proposed and passed in Louisiana and in other states across the country, as well as about the records and actions of the folks mentioned in this piece who are coming out of Louisiana and rising into positions of federal power. So I would love to spend some time. I didn't get a chance to do this in preparation for today, but I wanted to just click through those articles and read more and learn more. This also, I think I mentioned this was my first introduction to Scalawag magazine. I hadn't heard of this website before or this publication before reading this piece. So I want to just poke around their website and see what other kinds of reporting they're doing. You know, this was such a powerful piece and an important piece. And I think they're doing a lot of reporting around important issues affecting the South. And then, of course, then all of us. And so I would love to just see what else we could maybe pull from Scalawag to continue our learning and unlearning, as you say. Yeah,
yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, well, thanks, Movement Media Alliance, for
Yes.
doing the work and sharing what you're doing with the work. And I clicked on Scalawag because of the name.
Look at that. Oh, yes. It's such a cool name, too.
It's a great name.
Absolutely.
And then I found this article. It's like, well, this looks like a great thing to bring to talk about right here on this old show of ours.
I'm so glad you did.
Me too. Well, all right, Damien, you're up next time. What are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
Yes, well, I am so excited to be bringing our September book to the table for our next episode. Yes, a whole book. As you know, folks listening, we've been doing this thing where we read one book a month, and I can't believe we're already at September. Like, This will be our 8th book of the year, which is really just incredible. I'll pat ourselves on the back here. The book is called Defund: Conversations Toward Abolition. And it was written by Calvin John Smiley and was published in May of this year by our friends at Haymarket Books, who you just mentioned. Haymarket describes this book as, quote, a collection of illuminating interviews with leading abolitionist organizers and thinkers, reflecting on the uprisings of summer 2020, the rise of defund, and the work ahead of bridging the divide between reform and abolition. And then Haymarket actually goes on to say this about the book. Quote, through interviews with Marisol LeBron, Dan Berger, Zeli Imani, and Oluyemi Olorian, among others, Smiley considers how defund can bridge the divide between reform and abolition, becoming a catalyst to help organizers realize abolitionist visions. Along the way, these rich conversations illuminate the long histories of systems of repression and protests against them, how policing serves as a colonial project in Puerto Rico and beyond, why creativity and music making are essential to movement building, and much more. Giving voice to those committed to abolitionist praxis, defund is an essential tool for organizers as we imagine how defund goes from a hashtag to a movement to a reality. So this book has been an incredible read so far. I'm almost done. It's really conversational based. You know, it's Smiley having these conversations with some of the folks mentioned and more, and really all of the lessons that these folks have learned along the way, and advice and hardships and struggles and victories and all the like, and, you know, their reflections on defund. And so I am so excited for us to get to talk about this book next week.
Yeah, me too. I have been really enjoying it and am looking forward to talking about it because there's so much little pieces of learning along the way
Yes.
in every conversation. So there's a lot, I think, to dig in there and
Yeah.
talk about. And so I'm looking forward to doing that right here next week.
Let's do it.
All right. Well, with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. You know, I'm going to ask you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life. Follow us on social media, including Instagram and TikTok. Check us out on YouTube. Sign up and join us on Patreon to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. We'll talk to you next week.